Okay, so I think we should make a start. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nidendra Ferrari. I'm Associate Professor in Education and International Development here at the Center for Education and International Development, IOE. This is part of the Education in Conflict and Emergencies seminar series, and this is the first one for this academic year. And these seminars have been taking place for about 5 years now, which is great.
Yeah.
I'm extremely delighted to be able to welcome my friend, a wonderful academic from Harvard University, that's the way I think we should say. I'll introduce Sarah in a minute in detail. But these seminars primarily focus on the issues relating to education, conflict, and peace building. One of the research strands within the center actually focuses on that very theme. And we try to bring together academics, researchers, and practitioners to share research, but also to create a space for debates about policies, and also at the same time, how do we inform practice of educational delivery in context affected by violent conflict. And I think today's seminar is particularly important given that there's an enormous problem of education for refugee populations. As we've seen mass exodus in different parts of the world. And education, I think, particularly faces two types of problems. One is that education is a political process that contributes to national, social, economic, and political agenda. So when you've got a huge number of people coming in from other countries who live in transition, which is particularly sort of protracted, what kind of future that education should be creating for these populations? The other dimension is that we know that education as a conventional system, as we know mass education, schools being provided with resources by the state or people funding their own children's education, curriculum, and assessment, accreditation provided by the state authority. So that kind of conventional system of education is significantly ruptured because of the high levels of demands and different types of needs of the populations that are coming to these spaces. So what kind of educational future should we be envisioning? I think that is a kind of a broader educational question. I think Sarah is trying to look into those dimensions in her presentation in a minute. So I think this is why I'm absolutely delighted to launch this year's this year's Education and Conflict seminar series with Sarah's presentation. So, Dr. Sarah Dryden-Peterson, I don't think we would need much introduction for people who work in education and conflict contexts, and particularly who are interested in educational response in refugee settings. I guess Sarah is probably one of the most prominent academics and scholars who works in the area of refugee education, and her work continuously inspires both academics as well as practitioners who benefit from some of the influential evidence that she presents in her academic work. Sarah is Associate Professor of Education in Harvard University, and her work primarily looks into the connections between education and community development, and the role education plays in peaceful and participatory solutions to social problems. And her work is mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also Sarah works with African diasporic communities in Canada and the US. and Sarah and I came together, obviously because of the field that we share and our interests, and the graduate course that we teach in each of our institutions. And because we believe in collaboration and sharing and helping graduate students, and we've always wanted to have Sarah to present her work at IOE, and this has been a great opportunity for us. And recently, Sarah and I collaborated on a special issue of Education and Conflict Review, and some of the copies are available there. You can collect your copy. So Sarah will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and there'll be some time for questions and discussion, and we will see how we get on with time. That Sarah has to rush afterwards. But welcome, and thank you for coming, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Tajendra, and it's just delightful to be here. I think this idea of collaboration and sharing among institutions is so important, and it's fun to do that at the beginning of an academic year in this kind of launch of your seminar series. I'm going to stand over here while I talk, and you should feel free to interrupt me with questions, and then we'll also have time for discussion at the end. And one of the things that you'll see a lot of in my presentation today are maps. And part of the reason for this is that I want to kind of show you geographically some of the places that I'd like to take you in the work that I'm going to present, believing in the importance of comparison and the kind of resonance of experience from one place to another, a kind of horizontal analysis. But also trying to enable you to get to know more deeply some of the nuances of a few individuals' experience, so you can see that kind of breadth of what it might be like to confront some of these big dilemmas as a refugee young person, so a kind of vertical analysis. So I'll alternate between these horizontal and vertical dimensions. I'm going to begin with a rather extended narrative of one young man who I'll call Henri, who was a Burundian refugee in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then from that experience, I'd kind of like to use it as a touchstone through the presentation to draw out some of the critical questions about refugee education, where power lies within the design and implementation of refugee education, and the forms of belonging that education might cultivate as we think through the shape of a collective future. So I wanted to start with this map of some of the places that I'll talk about and some of the individuals. And then to begin with this quote from Jenny Erpenbeck's Go Went Gone. Had people forgotten in Berlin, of all places, that a border isn't just measured by an opponent's stature, but in fact creates him? Novels, this is from a novel, but I think as they reflect the human condition, I think scream out for us to recognize this is us in a way that sometimes academic work doesn't. And so I think it's important to see this kind of resonance across these different experiences of here we are in places where we're drawing borders daily in our interactions, and clearly in our schools where borders define who we are, where we can go, and as Dr. Farali was talking about, how we can build and imagine our lives individually and collectively. So now I'm going to move to Henri in Burundi. We interviewed Henri when he was 24 years old. And not long before that, he had come from exile. He'd come home from exile in Tanzania. But in fact, exile had been his whole life. He was returning to what he thought of as home, but he'd never actually been to Burundi before. Henri was born as a refugee. His mother had fled Burundi for the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1972, a year of genocide when more than 120,000 civilians were massacred by government forces. The war in eastern DRC led Henri and his mother to flee their first place of exile in DRC to Tanzania. They arrived in Tanzania in 1995 when Henri was 6. Through most of his young life, Henri lived in Mtibila camp in rural western Tanzania, not far from the Burundian border. He said, "Life in camp is always difficult. You don't have any job. You are only there waiting for UNHCR to bring you what to eat. life there for sure was not a good life. Henri described the kind of fear and isolation that he and his mother felt in this context. He said, our mothers, they used to leave the camp secretly in order to go out of the camp to fight for life. Since there wasn't enough food in the camp, his mother worked small jobs for Tanzanian nationals to make enough money to buy food. And this was a constant worry for Henri. He said, if the police catch you, you have to be taken to prison. Already in a place that felt consistently insecure, he couldn't begin to imagine life without his mother. In Tanzania, Henri found himself among a massively expanding refugee population, and among not only civilian refugees, but also combatants who were seeking cover in the chaos of large numbers. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, there were nearly 500,000 Burundians in Tanzania. And by association, as a refugee, as a Burundian, as a boy, as a teenager, Henri knew that he was perceived as a threat by the Tanzanian government. And he was treated like one. Matabila camp during Henri's childhood was part of a new global movement at that time designed to contain this threat of refugees, what we have come to know quite clearly as refugee camps. While the first refugee camps were built in the 1960s, UNHCR and host governments like Tanzania started to build more and more camps in the wake of the Rwandan genocide in 1994. The first refugee camp in Tanzania was built in 1990, but by the time Henri arrived in 1995, there were 19 camps, all of them, like Matabila, in rural, isolated areas designed for containment. If Henri's mother had fled directly to Tanzania in 1972, she would have found a very different situation. She wouldn't have been waiting around for UNHCR to provide food. She wouldn't have needed to sneak around, fearing arrest. At that time, Burundians settled mostly in local villages, with some initial support from UNHCR, which was then completely withdrawn by the mid-1980s. Henri's education in Tanzania mirrors these kind of shifts between rural, local living and camps that happened in global and regional refugee politics as well. When he was in primary school, what he came to think of as the old policies were still in place. So as refugee students had done throughout the 1970s and 1980s, they lived and went to school with Tanzanians in local villages. Henri studied according to the Tanzanian curriculum in English and in Kiswahili. The director of pedagogy at a rural Burundian school described this education as a reflection of how refugees were, quote, integrated within the communities in Tanzania. The Tanzanian curriculum and the national languages of Tanzania would be useful to refugees, as the abiding assumption was that Henri and other Burundians might just stay. By the time Henri was in secondary school, though, refugees were increasingly unwelcome in Tanzania, accused of fomenting crime and contributing to land shortages. Education policy shifted dramatically and swiftly, and all of a sudden, Henri could only study the Burundian curriculum in French and Kirundi, languages that, although he knew were his birthright, he didn't know how to speak. The government of Tanzania's assumption and intention was not that Henri would stay, but that Henri's future would be in Burundi. His future would be in Burundi. This intention was made all too clear to Henri in his last year of secondary school. Seared in his memory is the way he was forced out of the camp he lived in, Matabila. He watched the Tanzanian military burn down homes, ones he knew had been there for over decades. Rather than be shoved onto an overcrowded bus bound for a forcible return to Burundi, he fled to Nyangurusu, another refugee camp in Tanzania. In this camp, it was primarily a Congolese refugee population, and in schools, refugees studied the Congolese curriculum, again, preparing for a future of return, not to Burundi, but to DRC, and in French. If he wanted to continue going to school, Henri had no choice but to join them. So he did, embracing a new language and a new curriculum. When Henri arrived in Burundi for the first time, he'd spent 18 years, his whole life so far, in exile. He was hopeful that he could join the university so that he could contribute to what he thought of as his country. He was one of but a few secondary school graduates in Burundi, where less than 16% of young people were enrolled in secondary school at that time. But without enough fluency in French or Kirundi, and with no consistency in the curriculum that he'd followed through his education, he was denied entry to the university. Henri's educational experiences are not unique among refugees. His experience mirrors, and I think also begs, the questions that policymakers in Geneva and Nairobi, that teachers in classrooms in Kampala and Beirut, and that families and students like him in Matabila camp and in Bujumbura consistently ask themselves: where will I go to school? Why should I go to school? What should I learn there? What will I learn there? In what languages? And at the crux of all these day-to-day questions are big, life-changing questions, like what do I hope for my future? Where do I belong? And as Henri reflected on in retrospect through the shifting landscape of his own education, what messages do I get from those in power about what I should learn, how I might belong, and how I could imagine my future? Within formal national education systems, a real hallmark of education history globally is this kind of vacillation between standardization and autonomy, between across regions and schools, and autonomy at local levels within cities and districts, both in the content of what is learned and in the structures of what is set up. So I want to tell you about one example from Botswana and then from the United States, and kind of move on our map across the world here. So in Botswana, through our research there, we've found that teachers are often teaching exactly the same lesson on the same day, with the same notes appearing on the board for students to copy, whether they're in the capital city overlooking shiny new tinted glass windows of car dealerships, or in remote rural areas where donkeys wander into the school grounds on a regular basis. In this scenario in Botswana, standardization in education is a real nationalizing project, an attempt to bring citizens closer together, both in terms of unity, but also, as we've found, in terms of equality, with this abiding assumption that sameness will bring equality. The abiding philosophy in education in Botswana, dating to the time of its independence in 1966, is that this kind of standardization is the pathway to equality, to peace, and to national development. This conception of equality as sameness often has its roots in experiences of conflict, or in the case of Botswana, an explicit avoidance of conflict. Surrounded by nation states like Angola, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique that had recently been engulfed in civil war and long-term conflict, Botswana's leaders at independence sought to create conditions that would prevent that kind of conflicted future. Nationalized, centralized, standardized education was conceived as a way to redistribute resources with the aim of countering inequality. So now let's shift to the United States. Post-independence, so now we're 200 years earlier, in 1776, independence in the United States followed this same very intentional path of standardization in education. In the development of American schooling, Tyack argues we see play out the, quote, age-old problem of balancing order and liberty. Leaders did not trust families and communities with the kind of socialization that would stabilize institutions and consolidate beliefs in this very new nation state. And they turned to education as the space of deliberate instruction for unity. With the experience of conflict fresh, this idea of unity was really paramount. George Washington wrote at the time, quote, "The more homogeneous our citizens can be made in these particulars, the greater will be our prospect of permanent union." Standardization in education often results from belief in what Tyack calls, quote, "conformity as the price of liberty." In certain times and in certain places, feelings of security and generalized trust translate into the notion that unity does not depend on conformity. In schools, this notion allows for autonomy. So at the other extreme, I wanted to give an example from my own experience as a teacher in public school in Massachusetts in the United States. I had the autonomy as a teacher to decide more or less what I wanted to teach, when I wanted to teach it, very loosely situated within the state frameworks. During the 2001-2002 school year, I was teaching 8th grade humanities, a kind of combination of English and social studies. On a Tuesday in the second week of school in 2001, it was September 11th. In my beautiful third floor classroom with enormous windows, I was in charge of explaining to my 8th grade students, who I had known for exactly 1 week, why the school had been on lockdown, what had happened in New York City, what they might face when they set foot outside of the building. And we had shut off the school to the world, basically, for that day. I remember asking my students to gather in a circle. I remember sitting with them in that circle, and I remember feeling like what I said would be important, but that I had no idea what to say. I remember one of my students, Hadi, coming to school early the next morning to talk to me. I wrote down what he said as a recent immigrant from Ethiopia who was also Muslim. He said, "Islam would never allow this kind of terrorism to happen. I know that people who are hating Muslims don't know any better. They're scared." What we had planned to teach all of a sudden seemed less important. We shifted our entire curriculum to center the year around the lives, cultures, and religious beliefs of people during different periods of historical time. That was what we wrote out as our standard. We were still guided by the mission we'd developed before the start of the year and the state frameworks, but we shifted our focus to a study of world religions, as we noted in a letter to parents in January of that year, designed as what we wrote, a way to understand global history and to build tolerance for differences. We also noted in a reflection at the end of that school year that we believe students had had the opportunity to engage in authentic work that had real-world significance. But at the same time, we also certainly felt like we were figuring it out as we went along, with little certainty that we were doing it right or doing it well. 16 years later, I sat down with Hadi in his favorite pizza joint. I asked him what he thought, in retrospect, about this decision by his teachers to spend the year studying world religions. He hadn't thought much about it, but he did say that it filled a real hole. In this school year, in 2001-2002, in that place of Cambridge, Massachusetts, we had the autonomy for classroom-level decisions about what and how to teach. The generalized sense of security and trust at that moment allowed the space of autonomy to emerge. However, in the second week of school on September 11th, and then took only months to translate into widespread bipartisan education reform that's shifted towards standardization within the US. The No Child Left Behind Act, also known as NCLB, was passed in late 2001, that same year, and signed into law in early 2002. The act reinvigorated very quickly a stronger role for the federal, national government in school accountability, what my colleague John Mehta describes as not the first, but only the most recent, in a series of efforts in the US to, quote, order schools from above. NCLB was not only about a drive toward the united, conformity to prevent a kind of disunity at that moment. It was also aimed at addressing rampant inequalities in schools, closing achievement gaps, and ensuring the US's economic competitiveness. Yet the kind of frenzied search for unity in the US post 9/11 helped to propel this kind of widespread support for a swing toward standardization. Political and social context such as this drive decisions about the tension between standardization and autonomy in any place, in any time. Such can, of course, be more the case in countries where histories are contested and where governance is fragile. What are the consequences, then, for young people? In post-genocide Rwanda, for example, textbooks focused on conceptions of a united nation with goals of overcoming past divisions and streamlining and stemming possibilities for overt violence. The new and united identities fostered in the history textbooks blur group differences, but they also leave, quote, no room for any kind of ethnic identification, limiting space for productive conflict. Our research in Botswana, coming back there, demonstrates the trade-offs between unity to avoid violent conflict and opportunities for membership and belonging, particularly for those who are marginalized by the united narrative of a nation state. In Botswana, the process to discipline difference in the interest of preserving the nation has involved using the education system to promote assimilation of ethnic identities to a kind of superordinate national identity. This superordinate national identity is constructed around the culture and the language of the politically and economically dominant Tswana ethnic group. A Tswana teacher at a school in a Tswana-dominated southeastern region of the country explained the rationale, which is what we see echoed through government documents. You know, we are a nation, yes, formed by different ethnic groups, but Khaisano, social harmony, which is the national principle, is advocating for us to treat ourselves as Botswana, not identifying ourselves through our ethnic groups. It does help a lot, because if there's unity, there's usually less of a problem of ethnic conflicts, where ethnic groups will think they're better than others. In student surveys at 3 case study schools where we did research, 90% of students agreed with the statement, "At school I learned that it's important to treat all ethnic groups fairly." In interviews and observations, students expressed their beliefs in the equality of all citizens and their faith in the government redistribution of resources for the good of all. Even at a school in the northwest region of the country where only 9% of students identified as the majority Tswana, 57% of students reported that they feel equally Botswana and their ethnic group, the national and ethnic identity. Yet despite meeting many goals for unity through this kind of standardization, half of the respondents at this school also described that their ethnic group was treated unfairly at school, sometimes, often, or always, and 58% said that students at this school get teased about their ethnic group. Tato, a Form 2 or Grade 8 ethnically Waei student, described how sometimes when you speak your own language, they look down on you, thinking that maybe you're inferior or you don't understand some things. You're still not advanced. In addition, although students like Tato expected that mastery of this kind of standardized, nationalized curriculum would create a pathway for him to a paying job and inclusion in the modern nation state. But only 45% of students in the largely ethnic minority district where he goes to school make the transition to senior secondary school, compared to 65% of students nationally. In Botswana, the standardization approach to education has been extraordinarily successful at mitigating conflict. Conflict avoidance in Botswana was fairly improbable, given that at independence it was among the poorest and least educated country in the world, surrounded by countries engulfed in civil war, with an economy based on natural resources, with high ethnic diversity and one ethnic dominant group. Yet on the Global Peace Index, Botswana ranks 27 out of 163 countries. This index measures the absence of personal or direct violence, what Galtung calls negative peace. At the same time, what we see through our research and that of others is that Botswana has not created conditions for positive peace or the absence of structural violence, which shows up as unequal power and unequal life chances. So positive peace is not only about the absence of violence, but presence of the conditions that allow individuals like Tato and groups like his Waei ethnic group to access equal opportunities. Access to equal opportunities, or possibilities of what Nancy Fraser calls parity of participation, requires redistribution to counter resource-based inequalities and recognition to counter identity-based inequalities. In education, redistribution to address resource-based inequalities can happen through standardization, as we saw in Botswana. Yet recognition to address identity-based inequalities really cuts to the core of this tension between standardization and autonomy. What are the trade-offs between the autonomy that's needed for recognition to address identity-based inequalities and education that would enable full participation by all? What are the potential costs also of this autonomy vis-a-vis the kind of weakening of citizens' ability to communicate, unity, trust, and solidarity? This tension, I argue, that's so challenging to resolve within national education systems like Botswana or the United States is heightened for refugee populations. Refugees are by definition living and being educated outside of their nation states of citizenship. Modern nation states, of course, as we all know, are premised on the assumption that provision of service to citizens, including education, is the responsibility of that nation state. But for non-citizens like Henri, who's responsible for their education? In situations of standardization, what entity is the standardizing power? Is it the country of origin, the country that's hosting the refugees, a global actor? And in a situation of autonomy, autonomy from what? And toward what end? And then, what are the consequences of decisions about standardization or autonomy for refugees' futures? I'd like to go through a little bit of the history of refugee education to situate this tension between standardization and autonomy, and show that the history of refugee education has really mirrored these kind of global trends that reflect where power is located. So in this earliest time period, looking post-World War II, the era that I call liberation, refugee education was really organized by communities, as it was in much of the world at this time. Educational initiatives were local endeavors to an extent, but I think often missing from the historical dialogue that we look at is that those local endeavors were connected to aspirations that really spanned nation states, often connected to refugees' struggles for self-determination. So they were transnational. Refugee education has roots in these kind of transnational endeavors as the anti-apartheid and anti-colonial movements connecting individuals and organizations across borders. This education joined an exiled present for a refugee student to visions of a future of rebuilding a country of origin. In the next era, which is the era of the refugee camp, sorry it's dark on the slide there, I call standardization, where we see real normative shifts and the formalization of commitments through conventions and declarations and economic globalization to mark the development of new forms of global authority in education broadly, including in refugee education. Refugee education is under the mandate of UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and at this time, during the period of standardization, was really outside the structures of any nation state. Of course, there are nuances to that. So refugee education wasn't beholden to the kind of macroeconomic stabilization policies that affected many education systems at this time, but it did follow these emerging global patterns of global influences on local provision of education. But at the same time, nation states also had power. Unique to refugee education was its kind of dual existence, dictated by the political and economic interests of the nation state, while outside of the nation state's structures of service provision for education. And, as I mentioned before, this was really made possible by the advent of the refugee camp, the kind of pseudo-state within the larger state. So the provision of education for refugees on a large scale and their location in rural, isolated refugee camps led to refugee children going to separate schools from national children, like Henri's experience with shifting policies in Tanzania. The policies aligned refugee education as closely as possible to the country of origin, particularly in terms of curriculum, language of instruction, designed to enable a swift return. While the home country orientation of the structures and content echoed earlier era of refugee education, kind of looking to the country of origin, building a future in struggles for self-determination, the nature of this orientation during the period of standardization was really quite radically different, as Henri experienced. As camps began to develop, refugee education shifted from liberation to control through standardization. Segregated education for refugees was really premised on efficiency in service delivery, but it could only be efficient over the short term. It rested on this assumption of a speedy return to the country of origin, both for the sustainability of financing and also in terms of the ways that it prepared refugees for these futures. But the realities of conflict were really shifting at this time. In the aftermath of the Cold War, they were increasingly protracted. In 2011, the average conflict in low-income countries lasted 12 years, and in middle-income countries, 22 years. By 2016, the average length of exile was estimated as between 10 years and 25 years, 3 times as long as it was in the early 1990s. Despite the changing nature of conflict and its impact on the length of exile, though, approaches to refugee education were really quite stagnant. I just added Kenya here. The Dadaab and Kakuma refugee camps in Kenya were established in the early 1990s with the idea that they would be temporary, that the Somali and Sudanese refugees fleeing civil war at that time would stay in the camps for a few years at most and then return home. So Dadaab was built in 1991 for 90,000 refugees. In 2011, the population of Dadaab was over 460,000, making it the 3rd largest city in Kenya. Kakuma, too, was built to be temporary, established in 1992 in response to influx of Sudanese refugees fleeing civil war in Sudan. In our research, we've met children who are 3rd-generation Kakuma residents. Raphael, who is an NGO worker staff member in Kakuma, also a refugee, pointed to the generations of young people who've been born in Kakuma, explained how their experiences are misaligned with the practices of refugee assistance. We can't keep talking about emergency, he said. It is no longer an emergency in some of these cases because if people have been here for 20 years, so when does it stop being an emergency? And then we design programs that now become developmental. Because if I was born here and this is how I wake up and this is what I see around me, then you keep telling me I'm in an emergency? First of all, I've not come because I'm running away from anything. I'm here. So when you design things that are emergency in approach and in context, then you are not addressing my needs as I grow up. Students like Henri ride the seesaw of these shifting policies and practices derived from single moments in time. The history of refugee education, I think, can help us think forward toward the question Henri would most like to have answered with more certainty. How can my education prepare me not only for this moment in time, but for a long-term future of opportunities? So out of this history of refugee education, of liberation and standardization, has arisen a new moment in refugee education that seeks to address these questions of uncertainty, nationalization. Through previous eras, the purposes of refugee education have always been to prepare students for the future, but the nature of that future hasn't been fixed, either in time, in place, or by the individual imagining that future. Oops. Sorry, I'm going to leave this here. The Unhcr Global Education Strategy, which was released in 2012, assumed a different future than the one assumed under standardization. For the first time, global policy adopted an approach of including refugees in educational structures of host countries, rather than isolating them in parallel systems. The 2018 Global Compact on Refugees and the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, as well as the newer UNHCR Education Strategy, have further codified this approach of inclusion in national education systems. In 2012, I worked with the education unit of UNHCR to draft this new strategy, which focused primarily on access to quality education that would allow young refugees to build relevant skills and knowledge, to live healthy, productive lives, and build skills for self-reliance. There's a lot of jargon in there. As an overall approach to really meeting these goals was this approach to inclusion that would be guided where possible and appropriate with consultation from refugees. This language of where possible and appropriate was often lost in the kinds of conversations on this new approach, which struck many with long-term experience both working and living in refugee situations as too radical and impractical. So what happens when national teachers don't want to work in the areas of Pakistan where Afghan refugees live? What happens when 500,000 or more refugees with a different language of instruction cross the border? What happens, such as in the case of Mozambique and reminiscent of Henri's situation, when refugees who studied in Portuguese while in Malawi and Zimbabwe were able to reintegrate after repatriation, whereas those who'd studied in English in Tanzania and elsewhere were not able to access education upon return? Despite the apprehension, opposition, and uncertainty in global-level conversations about this overall approach of inclusion and how it would apply in each context, There is this new possibility for education to enable the kind of future that Henri sought, which emerged from recognition of long-term exile. Once this policy was introduced, there was really rapid uptake of it. So in 2010, only 5 of the 14 countries that UNHCR identified as priority countries hosting large numbers of refugees were refugees included to the national curriculum and language. But by 2014, 11 of those 14 countries were, and those numbers have grown. Yet despite this rapid uptake, the radical new global approach to refugee education was interpreted in different ways in different places. And these differences really reflect capacities and priorities and different ways in which the present situations of refugees are connected or could be connected to their futures. So in some countries like Malaysia and Bangladesh, for example, governments have rejected this approach so that refugees and nationals attend separate schools, generally with refugee education being informal, ad hoc, and with uncertain certification options. In other countries, especially where refugees live in camp settings, such as Kenya, inclusion usually involves the Kenyan curriculum and English and Kiswahili as languages of instruction, even though refugees and national children are separated one from the other, living in camp and non-camp areas, so they're geographically separated. And then in some places like Lebanon, inclusion involves refugee children attending the same schools as Lebanese children, with most of the same teachers, using the same curriculum and examination system, but at different times of the day, a double shift model. In a few places, particularly in urban areas, refugees and nationals attend school together at the same time and in the same classrooms. These different structures of refugee education that we see globally, as well as what and how children learn in school, both reflect and circumscribe the possible futures that they are trying to create. So broadly across countries, the futures imagined for refugees by others at global and national levels, by young people themselves, and by teachers fall into 4 categories. A future of resettlement, which is only about 1% of the population globally, to a distant, usually high-income country. A future of return to the country of origin. A future of integration within the host country. And a future of transnationalism. The future imagined in any given context and the structures and content of the education in that context are tightly connected, both shaped by and shaping each other. Given the slim prospects for resettlement or return, long-term exile is an increasingly likely reality for the immediate and medium-term futures of most refugees. So I want to focus for a minute on this future of integration and to the connections to the future of learning and belonging. I'll weave transnationalism in to a certain extent because what we find as most refugee young people explain their visions of the future is that transnationalism is some element of any future that they imagine. So Salim and most of his peers arrived in Dadaab as small children or were born there in Kenya. Decades later, they find themselves, like Raphael was describing, still in this same place of exile, now finished secondary school and determining what the possible options are for this next stage of their future. The approach of including refugees within national education systems was developed and adopted with this kind of common reality of Salim and his peers of protracted displacement. But of course, at the same time, it also relates to what we might call the confinement crisis, where the politics of migration limit the spaces globally where refugees can even locate temporary sanctuary, let alone long-term sanctuary. The incentives of global actors to push for opening national schools to refugees in the neighboring countries, where 85% of refugees live globally, are also certainly tied to our own political pressures to keep refugees out of North America, out of Europe, out of Australia. So with this in mind, does this global policy of inclusion open a crack in the kind of limited sanctuary and the ability to imagine a future that exists for refugees and renegotiating the power of the nation state in shaping opportunities? I think on the surface, it does. In Rwanda, including refugees in national education was a commitment of the nation state to refugees with broad-based support from top-level government officials to teachers. An explicit purpose of access to quality education in Rwanda was to enable multiple futures for refugees. So a refugee teacher in a camp-based school with students primarily from DRC emphasized this ongoing pursuit of a future that could be anywhere. He referred to both Rwanda and DRC as our country, signifying this possible dual nature of his and his students' futures. Given the protracted exile for young people like Salim and the precarious nature of refugee status in Kenya, another NGO staff member envisioned the need to plan education with these multiple futures forefront in mind. He said, "I'd like refugees to go away with something, and for me, education would be key. Because even if they relocated to a different country today, they would go with the knowledge, they would go with a paper, something that would help them in their lives in the years to come." To prepare for these multiple futures, a government leader in Kenya also underscored the need for children to learn not only about reading and writing, but also to contribute to nation building. And here's where these tensions really arise. What does nation building entail? And how does it connect for visions of where refugees' futures would be? One teacher described wanting his students to be in, quote, a position to influence the governance in any country you want to go to. You need knowledge to change government. He wanted education in exile in Kenya to make a better citizen so they can transform their societies into a better society, wherever that society might be. Yet for Annette, who is a Congolese refugee living in Uganda, the process of schooling as a refugee from DRC in Uganda was standard preparation for life in Uganda. She learned the Ugandan curriculum in Ugandan languages of instruction, sat for Ugandan certification exams, made Ugandan friends, and each day as she stood before the Ugandan flag, she sang, "O Uganda, we lay our future in thy hand." Annette felt this kind of social contract between herself and the state where she was being educated, and she felt like she was acting to uphold what she saw as her part. She went to school every day, she adapted to the new curriculum and language through challenges and senses of loss, and prepared herself for a future that was not how she had imagined it would be. Yet what she felt was promised to her by the state was not in fact the promise that the state was making, with other structural barriers at this time in the mid-2000s on how she could be a useful member of society, how she might influence governance, or have an education that could help her or others in years to come. Rather than being able to use her education to fulfill her dreams of becoming a nurse, she stayed exactly where she was, in a refugee camp in Western Uganda, tending her family's bananas. The promise that refugee young people feel from accessing national education systems really exposes dilemmas at the heart of education policymaking. What entity is responsible for the education of a child, and to what entity do the collective benefits accrue? Modern nation states take on the responsibility of education and the provision of other social services with the belief in a future of returns. Will the future returns of investment in the education of refugees accrue to the hosting nation state? Given the precarious nature of rights for non-citizens within nation states, a real historical cornerstone of humanitarian governance has been that it largely operates outside the state. In the standardization phase that we saw in the history of refugee education, UNHCR acted as a kind of pseudo-state, and it was an era of the rule of NGOs, financed by Western donors. Global actors took on responsibility for the education of refugees. In this current nationalization phase, this question for responsibility for education of refugees is being renegotiated. So while long-term residence in a nation of exile is the reality for the majority of refugees today, permanence in that nation state of exile is most often politically untenable and not actually what refugee young people and their families are looking for. So why then should a nation state invest financially, politically, socially, morally in the education of refugees? The rationale for this national investment is framed in most foundational documents for national education systems as a catalyst for economic growth. In most refugee hosting nation states, though, refugees are unable to access the labor market due to restrictions on their right to work, access to capital, or to own property. So given these constraints, a nation-state's investment in refugees' education can't translate into economic growth in that nation-state, limiting the perceived collective benefits. Instead of education focused on ways to create futures then, we often find from teachers who are teaching within these systems that they feel the responsibility to focus their teaching on helping students to cope in the present. The future is simply too hard to think about. One teacher, Maher, explained the negotiation he needed to do with himself about how to teach students to live productively in Lebanon. The Lebanese people rejected the Syrians, so this makes it difficult for me to tell the student that he should fuse or adapt in the Lebanese society. I cannot teach a student how to adapt in a society that is rejecting him. Another teacher in Lebanon explained how he rationalized teaching a history he did not agree with. All history books are biased, he said, but we have to learn the history the way it is in the books in order to get the grades. We are merchants in grades. Syrian grade 9 students in Lebanese public schools in Beirut studying for their grade 9 brevet exam, on which grades would either open a pathway to future education or shut them out of any further education, still could not be sure what passing grades at this level would even do for them in the future if they were unable, without the right to work, to put their education to use in Lebanon. Kalwa, a 15-year-old Syrian girl, had written out a detailed series of steps covering the next 12 years of her life by which she would accomplish her goal of becoming a surgeon. But each step was accompanied by a set of factors over which she had no control. Would refugees be allowed to continue in school in Lebanon? This was a question last week. Would it happen? Would it not? Would she be allowed to work in Lebanon if she did become a surgeon? The cyclical and conflicting logic of these policies are not lost on refugee young people pursuing their education. How can Kalwa and her peers not be burdens on the Lebanese state without opportunities to put their education in national schools to use? These legal restrictions aside, in Lebanon and in most other refugee hosting countries, the kind of learning that would enable young people to complete school ready to be productive and sparking economic growth is limited. Nasra, who was going to school in Kakuma camp, had initially gone to school outside of Kakuma and then returned to the camp when her family could no longer afford the school fees. This is what she said. No one wants to attend school in a refugee camp. The syllabus is the same, but the education is not the same. While feeling like inclusion in a national school in Kenya promised a kind of pathway to broader inclusion in Kenya and upward mobility, Nasra instead found herself ensconced in the downward mobility of ethnic, class, and regional inequalities in Kenya. The district where Kakuma camp is located, Turkana, has some of the highest levels of poverty and the lowest levels of access to education and learning in Kenya. So how possible is a future of integration for refugees if they access low-quality education within context of few post-schooling opportunities? Of course, in addition to the economic benefits of an investment in education, the collective benefits to the nation-state of education are social and civic development. Education systems in their structure and in their content orient this civic and social development almost entirely toward the nation-state. The benefits of this national orientation, as we talked about earlier, are usually around unity and social cohesion, as Tatu understood in Botswana. Lurch and her colleagues, in a survey of 576 recent textbooks from 78 countries, found that despite globalization, these textbooks continue to center on nationalist narratives that are oriented toward the creation of national citizens, approaches that are deeply standardized in their approach. They do find that diminished nationalism is more present in globally dominant countries in the form of cosmopolitan and global citizenship. But research has shown that access to the kinds of experiences that global citizenship education promises may be possible for young people with multiple citizenships and access to money, but not to the majority of the world's children who face one form of geopolitical restriction or another, and particularly not to refugees like Kalwa, who are non-citizens in their sites of education. In the case of refugee education, then, under new policies of including refugees in national education systems, incentives on the collective benefits of education, economic, political, civic, social, are misaligned. We have a case of education by the state, but not perceived as being for the state. Refugee young people find themselves within the systems of marginalization that already exist within the hosting nation state, related both to resource-based and identity-based inequalities. And at the same time, they are without the nation state's belief in any benefit to meeting their educational needs. So what from here? The elusiveness of an education that can prepare refugee young people for the future rests on understandings that futures of resettlement, return, and integration are close to impossible, wrapped up in the age-old politics of where power lies in education decision-making and the ever-shifting landscape of what kind of sanctuary is possible for those who migrate. The future of integration exposes a stark disjuncture between the present education a refugee young person has access to and the futures that they imagine or would like to plan for. As Tato experienced in Botswana, standardization of education more easily tilts toward a focus on unity and cohesion in ways that overlook inequalities, preventing particularly marginalized students from experiencing that very same unity and cohesion, both inside of school and outside of school. It's predicated on an unrealistic assumption that students will encounter equal opportunity structures as they pursue their futures. The centralization or standardization of refugee education within national education systems means that refugee education is often ambivalent to the politics of what refugee young people learn and the kinds of opportunity structures that they'll encounter outside of school and post-schooling. They, of course, remain non-citizens and outside of that kind of belonging within the nation state. The daily experiences of exclusion in school play out against a backdrop of global and national politics of migration. Another quote here from Go Went Gone, "Must living in peace, so fervently wished for throughout human history and yet enjoyed in only a few parts of the world, inevitably result in refusing to share it with those seeking refuge, defending it instead so aggressively that it almost looks like war?" While she writes about Germany, Kalwa's, Annette's, and Nasra's experiences in Lebanon, Uganda, and Kenya take on this character of having fled one war for their own physical safety, and yet finding themselves in another war for social, economic, and psychological safety in their daily lives, and for a future of opportunities without the right to work and ongoing xenophobia. Historically, especially during the recent period of standardization, responsibility for the education of refugees was globally held by a constellation of United Nations and NGO actors, usually financed by Western donors. The prevailing assumption held that nation states within which refugees lived were not capable or were unwilling to take on the responsibility of service provision to non-citizens. The responsibility for education of refugees has now been nationalized through a series of declarations, strategies, and compacts that has been rapidly adopted by global actors and by refugee hosting nation states. But the adoption of this policy has come with no indication that a refugee hosting state is able or willing or even should shoulder this responsibility, financially or politically, with no visible pathway toward the collective benefits that might drive engagement with the politics of curriculum and the politics of migration that are necessary to create the kinds of opportunity structures in which young people can thrive. This is, of course, both an empirical dilemma, as experienced by students, teachers, and the nation states, and a normative one that forces us to ask what moral and ethical obligations each of us have to each other, no matter our nation state, no matter how far from a crisis, to the education of young people. This period of nationalization of refugee education centers on both this empirical and this normative dilemma. And at its core, I think we find this ongoing question about the nature of education as a collective good, whose responsibility, and how this collective good can be realized for students, for teachers, and for nation states in the present and in the future. Thanks for listening today, and I look forward to discussion.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That's really stimulating. And I particularly like the idea of this multiple futures and the tensions around national versus...
Shall I come sit?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Great.
Versus global aspirations for what education can deliver, and obviously there are challenges around what education should serve for, and we often encounter with these neoliberal policies. Okay, forget about identity, forget about culture and religion, just focus on employability and provide refugees with knowledge and skills to be able to get a job, and that's the way forward and solve all the problems. But I think you also pointed out that at the end of the day, people are actually excluded and marginalized on the basis of their national, social and cultural identities. So I think the economic logic of providing training and solving the economic problem doesn't take us very, very far. So that's really sort of interesting, and I think there will be a lot of questions from colleagues here, and I would like to open the floor for questions or comments.
Thank you.
Thank you for inspiring lecture. I'm just wondering from your study.
Would you like to introduce yourself, your name and
great.
where?
I'm Stella Mijong Chong, and I'm doctoral student here in IOE this year. And
Right.
my studies highly related to the refugee education. Especially, I'm looking at the North Korean migrant life trajectory. Through their life experience, my study intended to reconceptualize peace building citizenship education or preparing for the unification of the Korean Peninsula. So anyway, I assume those refugees, they might experience through the transnational experience, so they can form very distinctive diasporic identity or transnational identity. So can you share your experience from this study, or can you define this diasporic or transnational identity from your study?
Sure. One of the things that we've found, I think, most interesting in a study with refugee young people in Dadaab in Kenya is this creation of the transnational kind of identity and the transnational, really, marshalling of resources. So we've kind of framed it in thinking about Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems of kind of the micro level where we have interpersonal interactions with each other, but then trying to think of what a kind of a transnational micro level might look like, or a transnational meso level or macro level, and finding that young people are actually seeking out and creating diasporic relationships despite the fact that they are really contained, that they can't leave Dadaab, that they can't be physically transnational, of communicating with other young people who are studying, for example, in Canada, in the US, in the UK, about trajectories in education, kind of big picture questions about how do I navigate the balance of my studies with the domestic work I'm responsible for. I'm the first woman in my family to have gone to school, to very specific, I don't understand this concept in physics. Is there anybody out there who can kind of help and explain it? And I think that that really does contribute not only to the kind of tangible resources or social capital, but this transnational identity of young people seeing themselves in this transnational space, even if they physically can't access it. And I think that often refugee education within national education systems doesn't take that transnational reality into consideration that many individuals are experiencing as they build their lives in exile.
And Sarah has co-authored a paper around these ideas already, so you might want to look up for that.
Be happy to share it. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Yeah. Charlotte?
Hi, Charlotte Begin from the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies. Thank you so much, Sarah. Inspiring as always. I guess my question is really about this. There is such a drive for inclusion in national systems at the moment, and particularly thinking about all of the work that's being done around the run-up to the Global Refugee Forum. And so I'm just wondering how we can bring more of the nuance that you so powerfully set out there to those conversations. and really try and influence that to take these things into account. And connected to that, do you see some examples of, at that policy level, where we are incorporating the kind of multiple futures more effectively? Sorry, I guess.
No, I think in some ways I think it's such a central question right now in terms of what does this mean for policy, but also what it means for the daily experiences of kids in school. And I think there are some really promising policy directions in the new UNHCR strategy, which transparently I helped to work on and kind of tried to get some of these ideas of like that it's not just about the present access to school, but there is an objective connected to these sustainable futures. What sustainable futures actually means, of course, is nebulous and will depend on the context. But I think this idea of constantly keeping the future in mind when making policy decisions and implementing programs can be key for any of us, kind of as we're doing research, but also as policymakers are making these kinds of decisions. I think what comes in the way is this very real sense for a national policymaker or for a refugee young person that they're just really stuck and that there is no politically feasible way to bring discussions of identity, for example, into classrooms, that it doesn't make the learning that is already going on more volatile. And I think these questions are very real. I think it's easy to sit elsewhere and say, well, of course kids need space to discuss identity, and of course everyone should kind of be able to bring those ideas out into the open. But in so many places where refugees are being included in national education systems that are themselves struggling with the history of conflict and thinking about how do we teach history without creating more division and conflict, I think there are no easy answers to this. And all of us, I mean, one of the principles that I try to keep in my mind is that I think we focus a lot of attention at the global level in refugee education on the refugees. And there's surely more rhetoric around like whatever happens for refugees has to also benefit nationals. But I think less this nuance of understanding that the experience of change through migration can be just as drastic for those who are there when refugees come as it is for refugees themselves. And maybe the trauma may be different, the physical displacement, but that when your whole life changes, I imagine myself thinking, okay, well, today there are no refugee children in my older daughter's class, and tomorrow a third to a half of the class would be newly arrived from many places speaking many languages. How would I feel as a parent? And so how do we focus policy not just on the refugee experience, but on this experience that requires transformation and negotiation for everyone involved? So it really is about the relationships and the reciprocity that way.
Thanks. So I might ask
you
a question. There's always a tension around how we facilitate a process within refugee host countries through which national governments adapt more friendly and accepting policies, more inclusive policies in education and other sort of social domains in order to benefit the livelihood and futures of refugees. But then if we think about this sort of very inclusive and humanitarian model from the national political position, it could be quite threatening for their power, right? So providing resources, national resources to refugees and also sort of allowing them to flourish in terms of their sort of civic or national or country of origin identities could be politically threatening for the national governments and also from the host communities. I think relates to the point that you were making. So how do you actually grapple and how do you negotiate with these issues, whether by providing enough resources to national governments that we could shift these boundaries, or whether to shift this national rhetoric into more regional kind of rhetoric where investing in education could actually regionally benefit for the people living in neighboring countries, including the host countries. So it's not bad to invest in Syrian population's education in Lebanon, because whether they return home or in Lebanon, it could contribute to a collective future of the region. So could you just share some of your reflections around those, sort of thinking from the point of view of the nations?
Yeah, and I've tried to kind of think of this idea of how do we address any of these issues, kind of thinking as a young person, thinking as a teacher, and thinking as a state, because I do think that level of analysis of a lot of these questions is missing. And yet, of course, we see in every national education system globally this real drive towards sovereignty and control. And so any newly independent nation state, one of the first things that's done is establishing a national education system and new curriculum and this kind of strong nationalizing endeavor. And I think that a lot of this work has made me really kind of raise the question of, do we need to rethink the role of nation states in education? And or do we need to at least question some of the assumptions that that is the right kind of locus of control for education systems? And obviously this is not a central decision to be made, but in recognizing just how powerful nation states are in dictating what kids learn, how kids learn. And of course, I think that we know that very well, but just how relevant those dimensions are for what the futures of young people are. And I think this is not only relevant for refugees, but thinking about the ways in which, I mean, we can talk in all sorts of like loosey-goosey terms about preparing all kids for these futures that we can't even imagine. But if we really do want our young people to be able to have dialogues across borders, there are some kinds of common understandings that can be useful in that. And some of it may be the common questioning of, why did I learn this history and you learned that history? How can we come together to understand the different origins of understanding this particular conflict or that particular conflict? But I also think that we need to ask ourselves whether it's reasonable for a national education system to shift its curriculum to accommodate the needs of refugee young people. And I think in an ideal situation, shifting curriculum so it could be more inclusive, so it could open dialogue on different kinds of issues, could be beneficial for everyone in that situation. But there are also real ways to see in which that could cause harm. And so I don't think there is a kind of blanket answer that way. But I certainly think that pushing aside the idea that there are very real and important reasons why a national government would say no, that is an important recognition within all of this policy work.
Thank you. Emily?
I am Emily Chester from Save the Children. Sorry, I'm
Hi, Emily.
I just wondered what definition or conceptualization of the term refugee you've been working with, because I think the whole concept of refugee is problematic in itself, especially where you find second generation, third generation, 10th, 20th generation still in a certain space, in a certain context. So defining it from different perspectives would help us understand when do people cease to be refugees after a certain generation or cycle, and when do they remain refugees forever, or if you're born a refugee and your children and your children's children also become refugees, does that make sense?
Right.
At least in refugees. And then the whole concept of history, I think history is problematic all over the world. I walked into a classroom in Sarajevo and the children were learning about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we asked the teacher, do they ever learn the history of what happened here in Bosnia? And the teacher said, never. We don't want to revive those things. So it's not an issue of one context or the other, but history globally we need to revisit and find out how we can actually tell the actual stories without glazing them with different theories that are not the reality, reflecting the reality. Countries like South Sudan, the Syria and Lebanon issue context is the same. And I just wanted to say that in Dadaab, we have several projects working there in education. And one of the activities or interventions we were doing was develop a curriculum in Somalia, mainly focusing on the voluntary repatriation of Somalia children back to Somalia because of the whole issue of repatriation and the government said they would close the camps. But you will find parents prefer schools that are teaching in English and Swahili and other languages they consider global, because in their mind they're not seeing that as one of the pathways to go back, but to resettle. And I like the chart that you put there, because they look at all the other options other than the depending on the context, because there are other refugees in other contexts who would rather return to their countries. So looking at it from that perspective as well. And also looking at the whole issue of security. The national governments are providing security to the refugees, but the case of Dadaab, the source of insecurity that is threatening the very nation we're talking about. So how do you deal with that?
Thanks, Emily. Can we take any other questions or comments? Sebastian, and any other questions? Because I'm just sensitive about the time as well. Okay, Sebastian.
Sorry, just a really short question. Is there a timeline for the Unhcr education strategy, and is it a refugee education strategy or a forced displacement strategy?
So I'll answer this very quickly. Oh no, did you want to take more? If there are, I didn't see.
Is there anyone? Okay. Right, okay, so maybe.
So that strategy is just out over the past kind of 2 weeks, and it is a refugee education strategy toward inclusion. There's some nod to broader displacement, but really it's a refugee education strategy. I'm happy to send you the link on that. Thanks for these questions, Emily. Emily helped get me into this work decades ago in work that we did in DRC and Afghanistan together. I mean, so on a few of these things, I think that this concept of refugee, we've been trying to keep really open in terms of the research, not going in with, I guess in some ways coming back to what I was saying earlier, trying to see like a young person living displaced in a situation and see like a state. And sometimes those conceptions of refugee overlap and sometimes they don't. And I think that, I do think that the kinds of legal restrictions and state definitions are important as we do this work to understand what kinds of barriers individuals are facing. But for example, Syrians living in Lebanon who are not technically refugees but may think of themselves as refugees, of keeping that nuance in mind as we're doing the research. And all of our research, almost all of our research is qualitative, so we don't have to check a box, but can get more of that kind of dimension. And I fully agree with you on this question of history teaching. And one of the projects I'm most excited about right now that I'm doing is a 20-year follow-up of history teaching in South Africa from a 1998 study and a 2019 study to look at different schools and how history teaching has changed in a kind of 2-decade post-conflict period, and what that means, from students telling me, just like you're saying in 1998, history is a wrong subject, it just makes me want to fight. How do I reconcile this very conflictual kind of past with what I want to see as the future? And what are ways in which we can foster those kinds of dialogues? And I think this question that about kind of Somali curriculum in South Sudan, well, another study that I'm excited about right now, we're doing a study in Lebanon and in Kenya with Syrians and Somalis that looks at the way that young people conceptualize their futures and think about the role of education. And one component of it is life history interviews with Somalis who have returned to Somalia, thinking about the ways in which kind of their education in exile in Kenya and how they've thought about that, used that, conceptualized that in their return, and connections to employment and civic life. And so I think we'll learn something there. It's not, ideally we would follow people over time and really see that, but this kind of retrospective I think can help. And this question of language I think is really important, of what we know might cognitively be best for kids in terms of learning in their home language and making a transfer to other languages. Versus what's practical in a given situation. Is poor instruction in a home language better than better instruction in a colonial language? Versus what parents want. We had one father in Kakuma tell us, I want my kids to be able to sweat from the brain and not from the back. And for that, they need to learn English. And that was his clear definition of what was going to lead them to that kind of future. And so there's all this, again, we see like a student, we see like a parent, we see like a state, and oftentimes they don't line up. Thanks for those questions.
All right, so I think we are coming to an end because of time, and it's been a very thought-provoking seminar, Sarah, and I think there's a lot of ideas and should encourage us to think about the future. And I think in the paper that you contribute to the journal, you talk about this backward design, where we should be imagining a future, and that should drive us, putting the child in the center of refugee education. And again, I think as Charlotte, you put it quite importantly, how do you influence the policy debates, within Unhcr, within the national government and the donor community when they engage with the national governments, in order to shift these discussions and to create this collective future, possibly reforming education to imagine multiple futures for refugees. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank
Can
you.
Give us a round of applause.
Thank you. And maybe if I can just say, I need to go just now to get on a train, which I know I can't miss. But if anyone would like to continue these discussions, I'm more than happy to email, and look forward to any kind of feedback that you have. So thanks for having me here today.
I wanted to thank William for helping with the seminar, etc. Thank you, William.
Thank you. Thanks, Jitendra. Great.